George Washington, in his farewell address to Congress, warned his countrymen to stay out of European politics as much as possible. Other men, especially Presidents Monroe and Jefferson, strongly agreed with Washington. Europe was a hotbed of intrigue and deception, where warfare was simply considered a part of foreign policy on the same level as diplomacy. The Americans wanted no part of the old world's wars, nor of its complicated and entangling treaty arrangements. For the most part, they managed to maintain their policy of isolationism throughout the first century and a half of our history. But by this time, advancements in communications and travel had made the world a far smaller place in which to live. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans ceased to be effective barriers between peoples. Immigration into the United States added valuable sections of population, and at the same time established cultural ties with other nations, especially those of Europe. American industry had become gigantic by the turn of the 20th century, and a vigorous trade also helped to wear away the walls of isolationism. Furthermore, following the Civil War and then the defeat of Spain in 1898, our country came to be recognized as a potential world power of the first rank. All these factors tended to draw the United States into world affairs more deeply than ever before. However, our people were still naive in terms of European politics. They could barely understand the intricacies of the foreign policies of the old world nations. That is why all Americans were surprised by the outbreak of World War I. Of course, even the most astute of European statesmen were taken unprepared by the sudden chain of events which touched off the conflict. It had begun as a relatively minor dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to Austria-Hungary's throne, was assassinated. The Austrians blamed the assassination on Serbian agitation and declared war upon Serbia. Now Europe's intricate system of treaties and alliances backfired and caused the war to mushroom until, in the end, no less than 29 world powers were actively involved. Russia had come to the defense of Serbia. France joined Russia. Germany declared war upon these two and invaded Belgium. England declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. Japan, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, Greece, and Italy were quickly drawn in. Up until 1914, all Europe had been an armed camp. Beginning in August of that year, the continent was transformed into a bloody battleground. The American people did not understand all these bewildering events, nor did they want any part in them. As leader of the nation, President Woodrow Wilson urged a policy of neutrality. Wilson was an unusual man whose lofty principles and strong character were to have a great influence upon subsequent events. Formerly a professor of politics, author, and president of Princeton University, he had gained political fame after his election as governor of New Jersey, when he cleaned out that state's political machine. The same cold, hard honesty which had characterized his early career remained with him when he took office in the White House. Like nearly all Americans, he was suspicious of European politics, and he intended to steer clear of them. Under his direction, the United States government permitted Americans to sell food, munitions, and supplies to both sides. Although from Wilson's point of view this seemed a sane and fair course of action, the combatants across the sea could hardly be expected to see it in the same light. It was a long-standing practice for the ships of one warring nation to turn back any vessels carrying strategic material to an enemy nation. Originally, the list of strategic material only referred to munitions and other items which could serve an enemy's armed forces. By the time of the First World War, however, even food and medical supplies were included on this list, for now the nations were fighting what they called people's wars. War now meant that all of one nation's resources were pitted against all the enemy's resources. Armies and navies only counted as two of many such resources. This concept, which has been termed total war, soon made Wilson's policy of neutrality impractical. From the outset, to prevent war supplies from reaching Germany, Britain interfered with American trade. The Allies insisted upon inspecting American ships, even those bound for neutral ports. Britain had established a naval blockade of Germany, hoping to force that nation to surrender when its supply of war material gave out. The British Navy, therefore, dealt with all foreign merchantmen in a very high-handed fashion, determined not to give its dangerous foe an opportunity to increase in strength. Americans were angered by these actions. However, President Wilson protested in vain against this violation of American rights. Although England politely apologized for the actions of her seamen, she had no intention of altering her policy. Her greatest weapon lay in the Navy, and she meant to make the most of it. At the same time, submarine warfare against American ships was a more serious violation of our rights. In retaliation against the British surface blockade, the Kaiser declared a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant that any Allied vessel might be sunk on sight, regardless of its status or cargo. Whereas the warships which operated on the surface of the ocean generally gave warning when about to sink a merchantman and could take the survivors on board, these things were not practiced in submarine warfare. In accordance with this policy, on May 7, 1915, a German submarine torpedoed and sank a British liner, the Lusitania. This is one of the great acts of villainy in naval history, as the ship was by no means engaged in the conduct of the war. She was a luxury liner full of civilians. The U-boats struck at her without warning, as was their custom, and very few people were able to reach the ship's lifeboats. Consequently, there was a loss of 1,198 lives, including 128 American citizens. This outraged the American people and turned their sympathies firmly against the irresponsible, cruel German emperor. Furthermore, Woodrow Wilson was growing more and more firmly convinced that the United States could not remain out of the conflict. After the sinking of the Lusitania, President Wilson sent a note to the German government demanding an end to such submarine warfare. The Kaiser's army may not have appreciated America's determined stand, but he was well aware of her vast wealth and untapped power, and so the Kaiser acquiesced to Wilson's demand. On November 4th, 1916, Germany promised that no more ships would be sunk without an effort to save the lives of passengers. For the most part, this meant that merchantmen and passenger lines would be given sufficient warning before being attacked, which would allow passengers and crew to evacuate before the vessel went down. This promise was enough to appease Wilson and the American people for the time being. Before long, however, things were to change. On January 31st, 1917, the German government notified us that it planned a submarine blockade against the British Isles. The Germans also included the waters of France and Italy in their sphere of unrestricted submarine warfare. According to the provisions of the new German decree, we were to be permitted to send only one ship a week through the blockade, and that ship must carry special markings. The remainder of the German announcement amounted to a grim warning. All other ships would be sunk on sight, with no effort to save crew and passengers. In this way, Wilhelm II and his military staff hoped to strangle England's trade and force the island nation to her knees. It was further discovered about this time that the Germans had been operating in Mexico, hoping to gain control of that nation's government. With Mexico in their hands, the Germans planned to attack and crush the United States should she try to interfere in the European conflict. It is clear from this fact that the Kaiser and his staff had little esteem for the military power of the United States. They took to a policy of disregarding American interests altogether. In the following months, many American ships were sunk without warning. On April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. This was a bold move for Wilson, who had promised time and again to keep our country out of the Great War. He reasoned, however, that the activities of the Germans directed against the United States were overtly hostile. This meant that Germany already considered America to be her enemy. Acting on the President's recommendation, Congress declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917. Thus ended our nation's long history of isolation from world affairs. Of course, the high-minded Wilson did not wish to enter the war simply for profit or prestige. If America was to enter upon the world stage, he reasoned, let it be to bring peace and not to gather spoils. Like many other men of his time, Wilson believed that an Allied victory in this awful conflict could mean the end of all warfare, and it was with this goal in mind that he labored for the remainder of his life. So it was in a spirit of noble enterprise, as one coming to the rescue of mankind, that the mighty, though untested United States began her preparations for combat on the fields of Europe. While her inexperienced armies were being mobilized, the United States helped the Allies at once by lending them large sums to buy badly needed food and military supplies. After 3 years of grueling, indecisive battle, Europe was exhausted. The two opposing armies faced each other on a front 500 miles long, stretching from the English Channel to the border of Switzerland. Each side had fortified its positions by digging a vast network of trenches. In between the two lines of trenches, in the area which was called No Man's Land, vicious battles were fought, some costing literally millions of lives. This type of tedious warfare was slowly consuming all the wealth of the nations involved. The entry of the Americans meant fresh stores for the Allies, and if the contest should continue much longer, this alone would certainly spell victory for them. Besides supplies, American naval vessels were sent to English waters. With British ships, they hunted down the German submarines. Thus the United States began its warlike operations against the Central Powers. To further aid in securing Allied control of the seas, the convoy system was used to transport troops and supplies from the United States. This method of transoceanic travel was effective in reducing losses due to submarine attacks. Thanks largely to the work of Theodore Roosevelt, the United States Navy had become a sizable, well-respected force. It was therefore ready to go into action almost at once against the Germans. While these measures were being undertaken, our nation moved to gather up a land force of sufficient size to compete on Europe's ground. On May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act to secure men for the armed forces. The nation had engaged in no war of any great proportions since the Civil War, which had ended more than 50 years before. Some idea of the undeveloped might of the United States can be gained from the numbers of men who volunteered for the draft as soon as it was established. More than 65 million put their names in for active duty. The small group of men who belonged to the regular army were given the task of turning their undisciplined countrymen into combat troops who might be able to compete against the tough, battle-tried armies of the Central Powers. Meanwhile, part of the huge sum needed to carry on the war came from the sale of Liberty bonds. The American people came to believe very strongly in the righteousness of their cause. They felt that the destiny of mankind lay in their hands, and so they determined to use their power to the fullest. While these preparations were in progress, the struggle in Europe continued to devour lives. The Germans tried to break through the Western Front in 1916. They were repulsed with heavy losses. Shortly thereafter, the Allies had attacked along the Somme River. They too were unable to end the stalemate. In October 1917, combined German and Austrian troops routed the Italians at Caporetto, forcing them back to the Piave River. In November of the same year, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in Russia, and the already badly mauled Russian armies stopped fighting. The Germans were now able to shift vast numbers of men to the west, where they determined to crush the Allies once and for all. In March 1917, the Germans struck at the Allied armies in France. They wanted to defeat the Allies before we entered the war. The main blow was directed against the British at the town of Saint-Quentin in northeastern France. The British were forced to retreat. In May, with still more men called up from the east, a second violent attack was launched against French positions on the Aisne River. To the despair of the democracies, the Allies were driven back. Unable to check the German thrust, they gave up ground which they had won inch by inch during the past 3 years. It seemed as though America's armies would arrive too late to save France, as the Germans pushed on vigorously toward Paris. Facing defeat, the Allies appointed General Ferdinand Foch to supreme command of their armies on the Western Front. Foch had long been neglected by the Allied leaders. It is possible that he was chosen as much to bear the blame for losing the war as in the hope of his achieving some kind of victory. Surely it seemed that nothing could halt the Germans now. To everyone's amazement, however, under Foch's command, the German drive was stopped. He had neither sufficient men nor supplies to do more than check their advance along the Marne River. These same armies had come this far once before in 1914, when they had driven through Belgium and took the left wing of the French armies by surprise. They had then been stopped at the First Battle of the Marne, considered one of the decisive battles of history. This time, they meant to pass on to Paris at all costs. Unable to force the Allies' lines, they paused to gather reinforcements, which came streaming in now from the defunct Russian combat zone. This breathing spell was all the Allies needed, for as the Germans hurriedly assembled their forces for a supreme effort, our country rushed hundreds of thousands of men to France under the command of General John J. Pershing. The American Expeditionary Force, as it was called, proved indeed to be the savior of France. Foch, well aware of the Germans' intentions, ordered every available American division to the front. Finally, on July 15, 1918, the Germans began their last drive of the war. They were stopped in the Second Battle of the Marne. The Americans proved themselves to be first-rate soldiers, and their numbers, added to those of the British and French, turned the tide of World War I. The power of German arms was spent. 3 days later, the British, French, and American armies under Foch began forcing the Germans to retreat. A massive counterattack pushed them back to the Veyle River. Thereafter, the Allies delivered one hammer blow after another to the weakened Germans. Ultimately, Allied victories in the summer of 1918 forced the German High Command to ask for an armistice. By November, both Bulgaria and Turkey had sued for peace. The Austrians, their armies virtually annihilated, surrendered on November 3rd. At this point, a revolution broke out in Germany, and Kaiser Wilhelm fled to neutral Holland, abdicating his throne. The new rebel government opened negotiations with the Allies at once. On November 11th, 1918, at 5 in the morning, the Germans signed the armistice terms which ended the war. Throughout the world, men rejoiced at the coming of peace. The Allies, determined not to have to face German arms again, made stiff demands upon their beaten foe. Let's see what these were. By the terms of the armistice, the Germans surrendered practically all of their fleet and all their artillery. This was the first of many steps taken to ensure against the occurrence of another catastrophic conflict with the Germans. But as we know, this was not the case. Now, let's see how much you remember about the First World War and the American participation in it. Here are 5 statements. Only 4 of these statements are true, and the other one is false. Can you recognize the false statement? 1. German submarine warfare against American ships was a serious violation of our rights. 2. The sinking of American ships without warning caused the United States to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. 3. Russia managed to crush the German armies in the east. 4. With the appointment of General Foch to the supreme command of the Allied armies, the German drive was stopped. 5. On November 11, 1918, the Germans signed the armistice terms which ended the war. Now, let's see the correct statements together and learn which one was false. Things to remember. 1. German submarine warfare against American ships was a serious violation of our rights. 2. The sinking of American ships without warning caused the United States to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. 3. With the appointment of General Foch to the supreme command of the Allied armies, the German drive was stopped. 4. On November 11, 1918, the Germans signed the armistice terms which ended the war. The false statement was number 3 in the first group, which said, that the Russians crushed the German armies invading her nation. Actually, Russia was forced to her knees and sued for peace in November 1917. What began as an international incident had become an international war of monumental proportions. Europe lay exhausted and practically ruined. Although Germany and Austria were at long last beaten, it had cost France the lives of more than 60% of her young men to do it. Russia had lost more than 10 million, and so had Germany. The scope and horror of this war alarmed nearly all men throughout the world, and with Woodrow Wilson at the forefront, they set about trying to establish a lasting peace. In this, however, they were to fail. Just 22 years later, Germany would again arise, more dangerous than ever to menace her neighbors. Thus it was that whatever glory may have been gained by the Allies in fighting the First World War, it was tragically lost after they had won it.